of our winter series, and happy March to all of you. Our next series, of course, will be a little later on into the summer. We don't have the exact dates for you yet, but I'm excited to say that we're working on a series that will bring women from Australia and New Zealand to join us, because the time zone stuff works out well to be able to include them. So my friend, sister Veronica Rosier is helping to coordinate that. She's in Sydney. So stay tuned for those details. We will do this evening, as we've done before, in that we'll begin with a brief prayer, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Meghan Clark. She will give a presentation, and then following that, again, we'll open it up to questions. You may put the questions in chat, or when we get to that part of the evening, you're welcome to raise your hand, and we can call on you to ask your own question. So we'll begin this evening with a prayer. And if you subscribe to Give Us This Day, this prayer is actually featured in the March issue. It's a prayer by Jane Darren, who used to work at the Center of Concern. She's taught at Visitation High School. Has been a long time, very strong advocate in the area of social justice. So I'm going to share my screen because I put the prayer in a couple of PowerPoint slides here. So this is her prayer called The Lenten Journey to Easter. We walk this Lenten journey with immigrants and refugees, lost, unsure of their journey's end, still longing for a home. We walk with those in poverty, unable to live lives of dignity, besieged by hunger and fear, trying to hold on day by day. We walk with those mourning what is happening to God's creation, calling us all to better care and stewardship of the earth, its creatures, and all growing things. We walk with women who are trafficked, who are abused, who are harassed, who still live in the silences, and who want to flee the darkness. We walk with peacemakers, walking a very rocky road toward peace, when so much conflict rages and so many fan the flames of violence. We walk with all those carrying burdens, yet we walk in faith and hope. Despite the suffering of the cross, we walk toward an Easter dawning. We move toward the seemingly impossible resurrection, a time of justice and peace. We walk, called forward through the darkness by the risen Christ. In his name we pray. Amen. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Meghan Clark, who is joining us this evening. She is an associate professor of moral theology at St. John's University in New York. At St. John's, Professor Clark talks to students both inside and outside the classroom on a number of topics in moral theology and Catholic social thought. She is also a senior fellow of the Vicentian Center for Church and Society and serves as a faculty expert for the Holy See's mission to the United Nations, which is very intriguing, Meghan. I may just jump in with a question and ask you to tell us about that role that you have with the United Nations, and welcome.
Thank you. I am really glad to be with you all. Let me see if this works. I'm taking my cue from having had the pleasure of being with you all last week, and seeing kind of how it works and what kinds of stories were shared, and this I've been thinking over and over again about this theme of the women who stayed and why they stayed, and how so much of the community's faith depended on the fact that they stayed. So I'm going to share some more personal kinds of stories than I normally would, but also give you kind of an insight into how it is that I think about what it would mean to prioritize economic justice and why it matters so much right now. And then share a story from my time doing field work in Ethiopia and how I ended up there, and looking at that. You'll see some pictures in front of you on the slide, and I do Catholic social teaching, which in some ways, how did I end up in theology? I ended up in theology in large part because of the family within which I was raised. It was actually a rude awakening when I got to college and then I got to graduate school, and I realized that Catholicism as a lived reality and Catholic theology wasn't necessarily something that everybody else engaged at home in the way that I had been raised. On the pictures on the right, my great grandmother lived until I was 15 years old. And her greatest accomplishment she would brag about was the fact that my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, became a Jesuit priest. The sole man in that picture is my grandfather, her other son. You can see my grandmother, my mother, my aunt, and then the older of the two small children is myself, and then the other my sister. I grew up in a family in which discussions of theology were a normal kind of thing, in which we were specifically brought, and were responsible, given items on the list that the food collection at church needed. When we were out on every 2 weeks, we would go shopping with my grandparents, who also brought us, with them. Back then, it was called the peanut butter and jelly gang, and they would make sandwiches. This was a point at which New York City wasn't a place where you had midnight runs the way that my students go on, and I've gone on with them. But their parish would make bundles of food and lunch bags that then others would bring in the height of when homelessness was really bad in the late 80s in New York City. And at the time, my uncle was working at Covenant House after college in Times Square, which looks very different now than it did then. My grandparents got a master's in theology. When they retired, they were both librarians, and they got a master's in theology for fun, in order to think of ways that they could be of better service, actually considering moving in order to be administrators of a parish that didn't have a priest. They liked being by their grandchildren more, though, and so that never materialized. But this level of conversation and interrogation of faith and what it meant and theology meant that my theology was much more formed by them than it was anything I was learning in school. My father is an economist who does poverty and economics. My mother's a nurse practitioner who does her research and is an expert on neonatal abstinence syndrome and withdrawal in babies during the opiate crisis. Before that, she looked at lead, and so her focus for her own work has always been on issues that are most affecting the most vulnerable newborn populations. And so the concern for social justice was something that was never really presented to us as a new thing. It just was what was modeled, as was the fact that all of that integrated with your faith. All of that led to, and those on this call will appreciate this because I know how you began your Women Who Stayed with the Bible. All of this led to a very heated phone call from home to my grandmother during my first semester at college, in which I went to a dorm program. There was a TV movie on Mary, the Mother of God, that had ran on NBC. And I went to Fordham undergraduate, and Elizabeth Johnson is a professor there. In many ways, Elizabeth Johnson is why I became a theologian and not other things. And she gave us this program talking through what it meant to be the theological advisor on this television program. And at that point, one of the things she said was how the battle she lost was on portraying Mary Magdalene as a prostitute, and how there was no biblical warrant for the way in which his art has portrayed Mary Magdalene. Well, for me, that was, one of those, just absolutely crazy, eye-opening moments, which then led me to go back to my dorm room and call my grandmother, who said, "Yes, Meghan, I know." At which point I was furious that she knew this and had not told me, had let me believe the things that I had been told in what at that point was 12 years of Catholic school, in which Mary Magdalene was always presented to us as this repentant prostitute. She responded, "Well, I didn't learn that until I was in my master's program, if that makes you feel better." But that is, that's the Catholicism that I was brought up in, that really put Catholic social teaching at the center of it, that encouraged my father to be looking at Catholic social teaching when Economic Justice for All came out and he was finishing his PhD. And it wasn't cool or really a normal thing for accepted thing for new economists to be curious and writing about religion and religious things like that. And so I have one of the strange experiences, unlike many of my friends, where when I announced to my extended family that I was applying to doctoral programs in theology, my mom's extended family, who just kind of looked and said, "Well, of course you are, because you're like your father." And the stories I've been telling are of my father's side of the family, and so it seemed normal. But that also meant that when I actually became a theologian and kind of got out into engaging more in the church, I wasn't necessarily prepared, and this is something we could talk about later. I wasn't necessarily prepared for the levels of patriarchy and sexism that one experiences on a regular basis, in part because I'd been shielded from experiencing it, because there were always these strong, very active women who I had the privilege of having experiences with. But that's somewhat how I ended up focusing on moral theology. My father took me to a lecture when I was 14 on the Beijing Women's Conference and the role that the Vatican had played in trying to get certain things about access to water and women into the final document. And at the end of it, I looked at him and I said, "Okay, I think I'd like to do that." It shifted a little bit, but trying to look at whose voice and whose access to participate and whose justice isn't readily part of the conversation, who's not at the table, is what I've tried to do as a theologian. How and why that happens is, for me, the center of everything is really Gaudium et Spes. And again, that might sound strange for somebody of my age who's not known anything from before the council. But when I think about what does it mean for me to serve the church, what does it mean for me to be a moral theologian, the center of that for me is practicing, is modeling, is living, is what does it mean to be church, to be disciple in the world. And during my final semester of graduate school, I was working on an encyclopedia article on Catholic social teaching. And I walked into my professor's office. Some of you may have heard or read Ken Himes, a Franciscan ethicist. And I looked at him, and I had been writing these paragraphs on summarizing Rerum Novarum and Pacem in Terris and these different encyclicals for this encyclopedia article. And I looked at him exacerbated, and I said, I don't know what to do with Gaudium et Spes. And he looked at me and he laughed and he said, Meghan, I don't think you want to say that too loudly. And what I meant was, I didn't know how to encapsulate in a few sentences something that for me was the very center of what it meant to be a theologian, to do Catholic social teaching that had shifted and changed the very way of being church in the world. And so I wrote 5 sentences that didn't really do a whole lot. But this sense that has always stuck with me, that Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the world, gives a scope and a context to what I understand my vocation as a moral theologian, and the fact that that has to involve being a public voice for justice and human dignity, is at the center of that. And so you can see on the slide what I think encapsulates that the obligations of justice and love are fulfilled only if each person, contributing to the common good according to his own abilities and the needs of others, promotes and assists the public and private institutions dedicated to bettering the conditions of human life. And so for me, that's something that stays at the center of what does it mean to be a moral theologian, and what does it mean to be a woman who stays in the church? I will admit, in large part because I can't really envision any other way other than staying, as frustrated as, how much I cringe frequently when I look at the news or we get updates on things. But that for me encapsulates, why is it that I teach what I teach? Why is it that I engage in public debate and public scholarship? Why do I do these things? It's for that reason. It's what led me a number of years ago to write a blog that got a lot of attention entitled, Would You Deny Jesus Food Stamps? It was in the era of the Ryan budget and the Matthew 25 circle of protection for in Washington, D.C., among different faith groups has been founded in order to try and protect programs for those living in the most extreme poverty in the United States in what was the budgeting process for the federal government. And I grew up in the generation of what would Jesus do? And people had those what would Jesus do WWJD bracelets. And what's always struck me about what Catholic social teaching and what the Matthew 25 scripture passage really says to us in terms of economic justice and inclusion, attention to the margins, is that what would Jesus do is the wrong question. It isn't what would Jesus do? It's what would you do to Jesus in what you are doing to your neighbor? And so it isn't, would Jesus cut food stamps, which was what some of the very well-respected people I respect, Christian leaders, were saying at the time, but that the real radical call of the gospel was, would you take away food stamps from Jesus? because that's what the radical identification of Jesus with those on the margins in Matthew 25 presented. It was the face of your neighbor in need, the face of your neighbor on the margins is the face of Christ. And what would our collective priorities look like if we really put that into practice? For me, that's what shapes questions of economic justice. So when I think about the fact that the last quarter jobs report basically showed all of the jobs that have been lost in the last quarter were lost by women, I don't see questions of what to do, within the what would Jesus do? But I see that those pushed out of the workforce are the face of Christ with equal dignity. Those pushed out of the workforce, not because they don't need the job anymore in order to participate, in order to meet their needs, but because things have gotten so difficult, or because that companies have laid off people. And why is it that disproportionately they are laying off their female employees, who are generally lower paid than, and of lower rank in many cases than the men? Why is it? What is it that can be done so that we have an economy and we have social protection that allows them to participate, that enhances their participation instead of pushing them out to the margins? So for me, that's led me to focus in my work on lifting up and listening more to the voices of women on the margins, to what is and isn't helping their economic empowerment, and for them to become agents more fully, able to participate more fully in the communities in which they live. The thing that's been striking me since Fratelli Tutti came out, and I thought I'd just mention it today, is because when we talk about economic justice and poverty in Catholic social teaching, we always talk about Matthew 25. And we always talk about Matthew 25 for the reasons I just said. But when we're thinking about Matthew 25, we're always in one position. The positionality of the question is always, it's not that it's one of judgment, but it's that, and it's a good thing, right? You're patterning, thinking about and answering for what we do or we don't do, and when we encounter our neighbor. But it is somewhat one directional. And what Francis has done in Fratelli Tutti in centering the parable of the Good Samaritan and using that as the overarching frame, and then within that talking about Matthew 25, is he's taken a story wherein sometimes we're in different positions, and sometimes and we all know the parable in which the priest and the Levite keep walking and the Samaritan stops to help the wounded man. But using and choosing the parable of the Good Samaritan and grounding discipleship for social justice there in the new encyclical, what Francis does is he pushes us to think at different points, when are we being the priest and the Levite? When are we the Samaritan? But also, when are we the wounded man? And so there's a dynamic there that I think is particularly helpful for, it's been helpful in prayer for my own kind of self-critique this Lent, and thinking about, as it says in the encyclical, acknowledging that we're all constantly tempted to ignore the needs of others. And that in facing that we do have a choice individually and collectively to be the Samaritan, to be neighbor to the wounded man. And he says, I should no longer say that I have neighbors, but I myself must be neighbor to others. There's an agency and activeness to the vision that we get of the centering of the parable of the Good Samaritan that I think helps us to think about, what does it mean to become neighbor? Gustavo Gutierrez gave a homily that got reported. He gave it in Rome, but it got reported in NCR about 5 years ago, in which he said that naturally we have no neighbors. We become neighbor when we leave our path and enter into the path of somebody else. That they're not just, neighbor is not just this natural category, but it's an active one. And I hear that image that Gutierrez has of becoming neighbor in Fratelli Tutti, when Francis calls for us to be neighbor to others. And what he does is then, right, he uses that as the core vision of discipleship in a very long and complicated encyclical that has everything from economics to politics to migration. I mean, everything is there. And that's one thing that some people have critiqued about it, is that there's just so much, what's the center here? And for me, I think that the center is that the parable of the Good Samaritan helps us think through who it is we're called to be in community together. We're called to be neighbor. And when we think about economic justice, can we envision something different as we're thinking about that? Can we envision really taking the age-old principle of the universal destination of goods and putting it into practice? Can we envision an economy that is different, social protection that isn't based on suspicion, and maybe think in terms of things like basic income, which Catholic social teaching and even the US government, people are starting to talk about more and more, thanks to Andrew Yang here in New York. Can we think forward-looking about how we can proactively come out of the COVID pandemic with an attention not to making sure that only those who are really, really extremely poor can, and scrutinizing food stamps, but thinking in terms of how it is we can have a system of social protection in which economic disparities start to get eaten away at, in which we truly have an economy in which everybody can participate. And that's, I think, what is so powerfully the challenge of Catholic social teaching, that helps us think through, and it's a deeply Ignatian kind of structure, right? The sense of inviting us as persons and communities to discern who are we becoming together, and are we becoming a more economically inclusive people in which disparities of not just things like income, but educational access, health, all of these things that cascade out from economics, or not? Or are we becoming more of a culture of exclusion? For me, trying to do this has more and more led me to spend time with communities in East Africa in particular. I went as an ethicist observing a medical program in Khartoum, Sudan, in now 10 years ago. And it all just fell together accidentally, in terms of my mother was part of a project in which I threw together a proposal and sent the head of pediatrics at a hospital in Ireland an email saying, Dr. Ryan, if I could get funding, could I come and observe your program and look at it as an example of partnerships between the Global South and the Global North for human rights? And shockingly, he said yes. And I was able to get funding and to go and do that. And that led me to spend more and more time. Sometimes it's been with Catholic Relief Services in Northern Ghana, but most recently, sometime in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, looking at programs that women religious, particularly the Daughters of Charity, most of them, have for enhancing the economic and social human rights of women in those communities. And so since our theme tonight is economic justice, and I know I was really supposed to talk about focus on domestic economic justice, but I think Mullumbet's story is really powerful, and I think it helps us see, or at least helps you see, who's at the center of what I'm trying to think through when I think about economic justice, and I think is a Catholic social teaching asks us to be at the center. In Addis Ababa, the Daughters of Charity Urban Development Project coordinates economic support and training to start up or expand small businesses. Among other activities, Sister Tiblitz and her staff noted that women's voice in household decision-making is often tied to income. Participation, which is a prerequisite for justice in Catholic social thought, is tied to economics, whether we recognize it or not. Exclusion from the market is often means exclusion from decision-making in the household, civil society, and government. With a combination of savings and credit associations and income-generating activities, their target audience is those who do not have access to other sources of economic development support. After entrepreneurship training, clients receive a grant with startup materials with a successful business plan once they have completed a successful business plan. In 2016, 420 income generation projects were funded. One staff member noted that often some secular NGOs and agencies won't fund programs like theirs because they don't see it as development, because it is based on grants and a grant program and not a loan, and see this just as a charity project. But I would say that actually no, what programs like this are, while they may be charity, they are much more strongly economic development and justice programs that help women and girls develop more fully as agents in charge of their own destiny. Mullumbet, the woman who you can see me sitting at the loom, is a traditional weaver and a successful recipient of one of these grants. Her margin for profit is small. And especially given when I met her in 2018, the inflation fluctuations that were happening in Ethiopia, the margin for error even smaller. A single mother of 4, the grant allowed her to expand her business, which in turn made possible expanding her house. And you can see the house on the picture. She sells her scarves at the open market around the US Embassy, where one can get the best price. One scarf is 3 days of labor, start to finish. Thanks to her business, her own daughters are being educated. Her oldest daughter has graduated from university as a water engineer. The second, saving up for a hairdressing program and would like to one day have her own salon. The third dreams of becoming a lawyer. The youngest thought I was crazy for asking if she knew what she maybe wanted to be when she grew up. She was only about 11 years old. All of these dreams possible because of the income generation grant received by Mullumbet. This small infusion made a large difference and highlights the way in which a holistic approach to human rights, human dignity, and economic justice is at once both personal and communal. Cases like hers provide a glimpse into the lives of women and girls around the world, and they can help us think more deeply about what it means to prioritize economic justice, where what we're looking for isn't a money balance or a total or an economic metric, but what we're looking for is enabling people, as Pope Francis called for at the UN, to become dignified agents of their own destiny. As this story indicates, empowering her and her daughters was about strengthening their capabilities and their agency. It's what I've found for me has been most helpful about things that Pope Francis has said regarding COVID and linking the COVID pandemic to economic exclusion in his COVID messages this summer was so important, because he emphasized not only our shared responsibility to respond to the crisis, envisioning something different, but also because in the end, for me, what I hold on to is hope. He emphasized not only our shared responsibility, but our shared hope. In the end, if I really had to think about and sum up why I stay in the church, why I work on behalf of economic justice as best I can as a Catholic moral theologian, it is the virtue of hope. Hope that together we can bring about more of the common good than is here today. Hope in the community of believers and disciples living out our obligations of justice and love together. And hope in the witness of all the women who came before me and who stand alongside us, strengthening us along the way. I thank you for listening a little bit to my story and why it is that I think Catholic social teaching is an important part of why I am a Catholic theologian and stay. But also I look forward to our conversation and learning more about all of you and why you stay and why you think social justice is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meghan. That was wonderful. I really appreciate you talking about the strong women in your growing up years and in your life that so influenced you. That's really amazing. And then all of these wonderful women you have met along the way, from Elizabeth Johnson to the people in East Africa. So the floor is open, everyone. Feel free, again, either to put questions in chat or to raise your hand. And Liz has a question, so she's going to start us off.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Meghan. And my question really does dovetail with what Anne just said, which is, well, first, young Catholic women who have a public voice, you are one of the reasons I stay. It's really great to see a new generation of voices. And I wonder, so we have this community that we formed to inform us, but also to build community and maybe be poised for some kind of subversive activity if it's ever called for. But do you have that with other young Catholic and emerging scholars or established scholars that are the next generation? Can you find community? Are there enough of you around to create sort of a community?
That's an excellent question. And I have both a positive and an honest answer. Not like this. I mean, not like the community I see in front of me. I gave a talk last week at St. Francis de Sales in New York City. And in the preparation for that, all I kept thinking was a group similar to this, but it was focused on Fratelli Tutti. It wasn't focused on women per se. And I kept thinking, I wish I had a parish like this. And the reality is that they are rare. They often are fairly close to Jesuit universities, to be honest. But in terms of that kind of parish life, most young women I know, we would love to have within a reasonable distance something like this. And one thing the pandemic has meant is that the masses that we are virtually watching and things that we're engaging with aren't necessarily our home parish and are more communities where they're like this. That said, in terms of my personal life, I gotta say that I don't think I could do it if I didn't have such a strong group of peers. Many of whom I went to graduate school with, others who in the field we've become quite close. And I have a group of other Catholic women theologians, most of them ethicists, but, a number who aren't, who are systematic theologians. And we provide a really strong community to each other, which is really, really particularly helpful and important, especially because we also then can both support but also amplify each other, which is also helpful and important, because when you're the only one in a context or the only one on a panel saying something, it can feel like, okay, well, maybe this is all just in my head. And it really helps to, okay, no, I wasn't reading that situation wrong. Most recently, it was my other grandmother, my mother's mother, passed away from COVID a few weeks ago on February 10th. And I'm very grateful we were able to have a wake and a funeral. And if it was a few months earlier, these just wouldn't have been allowed. But you would think that when the granddaughter is a theologian, the priest would simply use the readings that she picked and use the prayer of the faithful that she wrote. But no, he wanted to talk about what he wanted to talk about. And it didn't, and you have no control in COVID rules where none of the family can do any of the readings because you can't go up and down. And so it was one of those, it's one of those moments where I was thinking about that today as I was going over, what did I want to share today? And it's like, well, the first time I physically go to mass in a year is my grandmother's funeral. And much of what I'm hit with in the face is a patriarchal clericalism that just discounts the fact that that we had requested particular readings and written the prayers of the faithful. For anyone who's wondering, I read them at the cemetery. So my family did get to hear them. And in particular, my great aunts, her sisters who were still alive, and my mom and my aunts, like, were really happy to hear them. But so it is frustrating. And these, sometimes I think, and many of you on this call are active in church related things, so you'll appreciate that there are, like, the more engaged you are, oftentimes the more you notice. And so the harder some of the things are to let go. But I have a really strong family that recognizes at this point that, patriarchy is why what I wrote didn't get read, but also theologian friends who, no, like this isn't how people should be treated. And yeah, you had the right to ask for these things. And so it helps.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Meghan. As you were talking, I was thinking about, one of the downsides of being in liturgy is that I run up against this constantly, because liturgy is dominated by clergy in the theology of it and so on. And so, I mean, don't check your sense of humor at the door. Let's just say that. But you're right, a strong support group is just so essential. Otherwise, we'd be jumping out the windows. Other questions or comments?
But just to be clear, there are a whole lot of other younger Catholic theologians like me who, we're here to stay.
Right. Excellent.
Somebody sent me a chat asking what it was I had said instead of what would Jesus do? And I don't think it's a bad question. I don't think it's as pointed a question as Matthew 25 gets at. And the other alternative, I said, And this is mainly because I don't know how to find the person to hit a direct message back. And I'm a teacher who's of the case that when someone asks a question, usually more than one person has it, was, what would you do to Jesus? So you're not acting as God acts. You're not acting in place of Jesus. But the person you are either helping or not is the one who's in the place of God in the framing.
So Meghan, one question I have is, you talked about your experiences in East Africa. How could some of what you observed be translated to some of our issues in the United States with women, in terms of their jobs, their economic struggles, raising family, doing all of those things that women do?
So one of the things that that is similar in both cases is that the majority of responsibilities for family things, and that could be childcare, that could be caregiving, that could be taking somebody to the doctor, tends to fall on women. And so when you don't have other forms of social protection built into the system for caregiving and time off and all of these things, that it all has an economic impact. And in what I've found is that people are often much more concerned with somehow protecting the idea they have of care, as this virtuous, generous thing that leads everywhere a reticence to developing real economic policies that could help support the caregiving that's happening in families. And Europe's mostly gotten over that. Much of the global South is struggling to try and figure out how to create these systems because they've never had them before, and they have budgets that are, they do not necessarily have the budgets that can compensate the development level to enact them. But here in the United States, it's simply we don't have the willpower, right? We could have, and there have been points in time where it's been discussed, and yet we're the only developed country that doesn't have any standard child allowance built into their social protection program. All of Europe has long had that. Our economic systems are framed so that in order to get ahead or get any sort of sense of equality, there's this whole entity of just our basic human lives that almost always ends up falling to women, but somebody has to do it. And so it either ends up then not getting done, right? Or people just end up more and more pressured trying to figure out how to get it done. And so those basic economic realities of women trying to take care of themselves and their families, I think is right. Like we see that here in the United States, and that's very much the situation that I saw across East Africa. This was especially true with a community that I spent some time with, a program the Daughters of Charity have about an hour outside of Nairobi, which is focused on children who have severe disabilities. And their programs have expanded as those children that first were there aged. But what I found with a lot of these programs is that programs that start as focused on children fairly quickly morph also into a whole series of programs that engage the mothers and the rest of the family, because most of our problems are communal problems in which it's never just one person affected. It's why some of the conversations about really taking a serious look at what basic income might provide as a structural system. For those who don't know, some of the things being talked about, one, in the pandemic is a child benefit, but they're only talking about it in terms of COVID right now. Nobody's proposed anything long-term in the United States. Other parts of the world have structural responses. But in the basic income is kind of sets a floor below which nobody falls. And it is simply everybody gets it. And if you make it more than enough money, right, you pay it back in taxes. So this isn't this idea, I don't need a basic income payment. I have a very good job. But I will just, right, like you build in the structure so nobody is stigmatized, nobody falls below. And then those, right, and then you correct for certain things, like my taxes over that amount will be higher than it is on the basic income amount. This isn't rocket science in terms of people who work on poverty and social protection have been talking about. My father's been writing about this since the 1990s. But we're at a moment where even Catholic social teaching is thinking outside the box in ways that aren't just fringe, and that's kind of exciting to see Pope Francis really pushing us to think about building a different world, not just a little bit better one.
Thank you. Jean.
Meghan, I'm in the El Salvador committee, and we have had a sister parish in San Salvador for over 30 years. And I never leave the parish when I go down. So I have a limited knowledge of the Catholic Church activities in El Salvador. But the people in the parish tell me that the church serves the rich. Now, our new chairman, Margie Legowski, stays for months in El Salvador and goes all over. So she meets Catholic workers, Catholic charities. She meets people. So there's both the institutional, hierarchical church that serves the rich, and then there's Catholic charities and other activities that are working in the rural areas. The Daughters of Charity sound magnificent. Did you get any sense of the archdiocese of the institutional church in East Africa, in Kenya or Tanzania, whether they are really committed to being a neighbor or serving the poor?
It's interesting, and it's complicated. In Ethiopia, the majority religion is Ethiopian Orthodox. And so the Catholic Church, its place in society is largely as a trusted purveyor of social services for the poor. And so there's this kind of interesting civil space that they talked about, wherein the Daughters of Charity and other Catholic groups were kind of the trusted place for an HIV/AIDS program, for things, which ended up meaning that they could be a space and a voice for a whole host of women's empowerment programs, even though they, at the time, I was there before the current government, but it was actually in the region where there's currently all the violence. And I am praying for the community I met with. I have not heard back from any of them since the violence in Tigray broke out. It created a space where they could actually work on women's rights, human rights. They just couldn't say those words. But you could say economic, you could say jobs, you could say economic empowerment. And it seemed in what I saw that the official church, the diocese in the different context, also kind of saw and gave women religious a great deal of space in those areas. But the flip side was that, in a community that was almost entirely Ethiopian sisters, right? So not an international community. They were all Ethiopians who became Daughters of Charity. In Kenya, it was a mix of missionary sisters from Europe and the United States and younger Kenyan sisters. There was still a sense there that women weren't, allowed to get PhDs. There was it was very difficult for them to study within the church in terms of who was approved to study theology and that kind of stuff. They could get teaching degrees, but not, or nursing degrees. Things were very gendered. But in Ethiopia, I didn't get the sense of kind of the institutional church as being for the rich, because I don't know that the rich in Ethiopia are Catholic. In Kenya, it's tricky because they walk a line. The Archbishop of Nairobi has a great deal of power with President Kenyatta, who's Catholic. And so it is the church of the elites as well as, and I didn't really get a sense of what the Archdiocese of Nairobi did. I spent most of my time, I was teaching at the Jesuit school there. And so I spent my time with them and going with them and then with various women religious. I didn't really get a sense of what they're doing. And I don't have enough of a sense, and I should, but I don't, in terms of what the wealthy class of elites in Kenya kind of look like compared with, honestly, because of the Jesuits and Romero, I have a little bit better sense of what that looks like in El Salvador, even though I've never been. And how much of those power dynamics are shaped by the US as its primary interlocutor. In Kenya, it's not the US, it's a combination of the UK and China that are the outside forces. So I'm sorry, I did not have a better answer for your question.
Thank you, Meghan. So, so Peggy Clardy is asking about your role with the Holy See mission to the UN. Can you say a little bit about that?
So one of the things that the Vincentian Center for Church and Society at St. John's does is we help out the UN mission to the Holy See's UN mission. And it's one of those things that sounds cooler than it is. I mean, it's mostly reading fairly boring reports and writing summaries. But I do have a cool photograph of meeting Ban Ki-moon at a reception. And I have gotten to, I'm part of a team that helps with the Commission on the Status of Women and the Commission on Social Development. And so it means that I will go to meetings and I'll read reports and I'll give them my feedback on what I think. The diplomats, and Rome make the decisions that they make. I don't think I have a whole lot of influence per se. But what I do is I have a voice in order to raise what it is that I think is important in a particular report on human trafficking or a particular report on from UN Women on the state of Beijing plus whatever we're up to now. I think it's 30, or those kinds of things, which I think which is a seat at the table. It also has, I think, made me a much better theologian because I also I see what happens from a different perspective at a multilateral like the United Nations, as well as having the experience of going to East Africa and the experiences that I have with my students in terms of where young people are at. And so it at least it's also a place which often gives me a great deal of hope. Because I will say this about the United Nations, as flawed as it is, it's really important that we have it. And it's really important that we make it better. And that we have real reform that makes it better and gives the global South particularly more of a voice. But it's also a place where the Catholic Church through the Holy See occupies a really unique position. And I know it often gets, right, some people think they shouldn't be there. I'm very glad that they are there. And a lot of times people only focus, especially on gender, they only focus on things that they say about abortion. And they certainly say those. But there also is oftentimes, you know, who is it that has the most credibility in order to make statements on nuclear weapons, in order to make statements on peace, in order to get people to a table where they have very fraught diplomatic relationships? And the Holy See has a table and has an ability to have a conversation in which they're not a political entity in terms of a power player at the right? There's no question of sanctions. There's no question of whether or not your development aid is safe if you oppose the United States or China on this. Right? All of those diplomatic games aren't so much there's not the Vatican is not a state like that. But it does have a seat at the table as what is a sovereign state. And so, you know, and with the network of Catholics around the world, it often has some of the best intelligence about what's going on the ground. And so there's an ability to raise the perspective of far off corners where people aren't paying attention to what's happening. And so I think it really is, I think it's a place where the church does an awful lot of good. I'm not saying there's nothing complicated about some of the stuff also, but it's also a place that as a Catholic gives me a lot of hope. There are a whole bunch of questions coming in the chat. I'm very grateful for everyone who's expressing condolences and prayers about my grandmother. I thank you for that.
So I don't know. So we're at a little past 6:30, and we do have a lot more questions. So I think, you know, maybe you can direct us to things we can read or look to further our understanding of how we can be church. I love the phrase you use about not how do we be in the church, but how do we be church. I looked up this Matthew 25 circle of protection. I mean, so maybe there are other suggestions like that you have. I mean, I think some people were wondering about the bishops and what initiatives they're taking, but just if you have any sort of final wrap up about where to point people that still have questions, which of course we all do.
That is a good question. Someone wrote in the chat and they want about young people, and I was asked the question about newer theologians. I would say if people want to kind of see what lots of new fresh ideas are from my generation and the one after me, there's a really cool blog called Daily, D-A-Y-L, daily as in the day, Daily Theology.
Ooh.
And it's pretty cool. And a lot of the writers are friends of mine. And there are a number of good people that still blog at catholicmoraltheology.com too. I don't blog anymore, mainly for time. In terms of getting involved and getting engaged, globally, I pay a lot of attention to things and initiatives from Catholic Relief Services and Partners in Health. Those are two agencies that I respect and trust, and I use them not only to see kind of, they're also a good barometer of where they're asking for more that people could do. Sometimes that's money, sometimes it's other things. Catholic Relief Services right now has a advocacy campaign going, asking everybody to contact their elected representatives to make sure that foreign economic aid is part of the pandemic relief bill that gets settled on, that the foreign aid part doesn't disappear. I wish I knew what good initiatives were that were going on here. Domestically, I would say that Repairers of the Breach are doing amazing work, and that's the Reverend Barber, William Barber. He is not a Catholic, he is a Protestant minister. But he, again, in terms of local activities and campaigns for structural change, that's the best kind of the Poor People's Campaign that I've been following. The Circle of Protection is cool, and I think it still exists. It started back when John Carr was in charge of the Justice and Peace Development Office at the USCCB, and Bishop Stephen Blair from Stockton was chairman of the Domestic Justice Committee, and they were part of the founding of it. In terms of things that people might want to read, other than the blogs, my brain cannot think of anything at the moment.
That is enough, just knowing that there are young Catholic theologians who are using your voices as you are, and you have a great voice and you have a great turn of phrase. What would Jesus do, and what would we do to Jesus or for Jesus? That's a really great thing to meditate upon this Lenten season. So Meghan, thank you so much for taking the time to come, because you do have a full day. Oh, it's really, really wonderful for you to be here, and you're always welcome at any of our sessions, and I'll give you a big hand. We'll meet again, as Anne said, in summer, and we wish you well the rest of this semester, whether it's in person or digitally, and bless you. And the rest of you, if you haven't had a chance to answer the survey, there was a few people who wanted to take some time to think through or process or talk about this series or any of the other sessions we've had. So just go ahead and answer the poll if that's something that you're interested in as we go forward and plan. And I think with that, if you want to unmute and thank Meghan.